The Democratic Republicans and the Federalists argued a lot about both domestic and foreign policy. The foreign issues at this time really dealt with the French. In 1789, the French Revolution started. Now, without getting into too much detail on the French Revolution, there's essentially three phases. There's the first phase, which is from 1789 to about 1792, and that first phase is usually called the Constitutional Revolutionary phase. This is where we have the storming of the Bastille, which started the French Revolution. Lafayette was actually there and had one of the keys to the Bastille, and actually sent it to George Washington. It's at Mount Vernon now. But anyways, the first constitutional phase is a little less violent. Then in 1792, 3, and 4, we have the Reign of Terror, where about 40,000 people were killed by the French government. And then after that, we have the Consul, which is kind of this weak milquetoast government, which eventually leads to Napoleon's reign in about 1800. Now, the issue was how to deal with the war. With revolutionary France. Europe went to war with France to try to put down the revolutionary fire because the English and other monarchies were afraid that it would come to them. But the Americans didn't want to get involved in a war. We're weak at this point. We don't really have a military. We're in debt already. So the question wasn't should we go to war, but how do we stay out? And there were different interpretations on how to do that. The Federalists tended to support the British in this cause. Hamilton led the Federalists. He wanted to have sort of a British-style economy. The Democratic Republicans tended to support the French Revolution ideals. And while Jefferson is going to support them all the way through the Reign of Terror, they kind of fall off and fall into the patriotic anti-French side eventually. This all starts back in the Washington administration in 1793 when France sent an ambassador here called Janay. This is often called the Citizen Janay incident. He was welcomed by Republicans. He arrived in Charleston. The debate was whether or not to recognize the French as a nation, the revolutionary French as a nation. The Washington decided to do so, although he decided to remain neutral. Janay comes over as an ambassador, and immediately, while he's supposed to be neutral on our turf, he starts recruiting privateers, essentially pirates, which would go out and attack British ships. This is a big no-no. He's violating all sorts of issues. Eventually, Washington is forced to send him away and request a new ambassador. But the Republicans and the Democrats start to see the Federalists start to see this as a big conflict. Right after that, John Jay, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and a Federalist, was sent to Britain to negotiate a treaty with Britain to try to keep us out of the war. He signs a treaty. He thought he got good terms. When it comes back, many people were upset about it, mostly the rural South, because the terms of the treaty were designed to help out the merchants and our manufacturing. So we have this North-South split. Also, it makes France very mad. So the Republicans were concerned about the French, what Jefferson thought of as a perpetual alliance. So by the time John Adams takes office in 1796, we are essentially in a state of a quasi-war with France. The French were plundering about 300 American vessels by 1797. The United States sent ambassadors over to France and try to negotiate a treaty, but they refused to even meet with the American ambassadors. In an event called the XYZ Affair, they demanded basically a bribe in order to meet with the Americans. And hostilities soar, right? The Americans were very upset about this. What's interesting is the political parties start to see conspiracy theories. The Federalists wanting to enact war powers to try to fight this war, passed something called the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Democratic Republicans see this as an attempt to silence them because most of the immigrants that were coming from the other countries tended to be agrarian, tended to be Republicans. The Alien and Sedition Acts gave the president power to deport dangerous aliens. Any criticism, the Sedition Act allowed any criticism of the administration to be to lead to imprisonment. Thank you. Jefferson and Madison actually go back to their home states, Kentucky and Virginia, and they get resolutions passed, known as the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. where they argued that this was an infringement on constitutional rights and that the state should be able to nullify an act of Congress. This is two important things. First of all, it sets up the possibility of disunion, and it's going to be a foreshadowing of the nullification crisis under Jackson and then later the secession by South Carolina. It's also important to note that they haven't agreed on who's allowed to interpret the Constitution yet. Notice this is a job the Supreme Court would be able to have today, but we haven't had Marbury versus Madison yet, which gives the power of the judicial review to the Supreme Court, so we have a very weak Supreme Court. Jefferson is trying to give that power of judicial review to the states, which eventually doesn't work.